Okay, so our topic today is pretty broad, but I've tried to hone into a few of the things that I think would be most relevant to everyone, as I understand you are all thinking of innovations and that have to do with climate change and other things as well, but from a climate lens. So today we're going to be discussing climate change and climate risk management, and then going a bit more into the carbon footprint and sustainability models. So I was thinking actually that I would like to go from a global to a local level, because I think, of course, as we know, climate change is a global issue. But we in Pakistan are affected very disproportionately from it due to, being a low emitter country, but not having enough resources to actually build that kind of climate resilience that we need. And the floods of last year were a testament to that within a global and a local context. So I know it sounds a bit weird, and this diagram is quite confusing actually, but let me go into it a bit more. So what is the Earth Overshoot Day? So basically, it's a pretty neat kind of idea that climate scientists came up with to understand how our carbon footprint works and how does it work in a relative context. Could we please have the poll? There is a kind of disruption between the two. And of course, we are, emerging, developing economy. So a lot of the times we think of our growth in highly economic terms and not with the ecological consequences. So that's exactly why they came up with this Earth Overshoot Day, that we just don't look at countries within an economic scenario, but also in an ecological way. So in that way, actually, Canada and the US are doing terribly, because if the whole world started to consume and produce like Canada and the US, we would need 5 other planets to support the human race. And of course, we only have one planet, so that is not a feasible, sustainable model. So moving on, let's get to the Pakistan context. So with Pakistan, we have a couple of national priorities and indicators that we have set up for our mitigation and adaptation of climate change. So, so mitigation is kind of curbing our GHG, our greenhouse emissions, to the extent that we feel like we are not building more climate catastrophe, basically, that we are trying to even out our emissions locally and globally. So that's mitigation. That's basically kind of actually trying to attack the root cause of the problem, which is carbon emissions, right? Adaptation, which is a bit more contested as well. It's also a bit more realistic, I guess, because we know that climate change is happening no matter what, right? Even if we keep in the 1.5 Celsius range, we are still going to be having climate change, right? And climate crises. But adaptation talks to the situations we can have, or the mechanisms and tools we can have where we can build resilience. So even if a climate change catastrophe such as a flood or, like a earthquake happens, then we are resilient enough and we have the infrastructure to not only deal with the relief and rehabilitation needed, but also to kind of help itni destruction ho hi na us catastrophes. For instance, the floods that happened here, if we had an early warning system, we could have mitigated or adapted to the crisis by about 35%. So 35% less loss and damage would have been incurred. Similarly, even in countries like Turkey, if they had a better disaster risk reduction and adaptation strategy, they would have also, again, faced a lot less of the destruction they did. So that's what adaptation is. So as you can see, we have a very ambitious goal of 50% reduction in projected emissions by 2030. And with adaptation, again, we are looking at, building more resilience. So we need about 200 billion USD to actually support these NDC commitments. And, that is not happening. And we have about needing 101 billion USD. For just energy. So as we all know, our energy situation is not good. We're in a crisis. So these are like the different ideas of how we can reach these. Moving forward to climate risk management. So I wanted to go over what is climate risk management. So basically, it's about, as you can read, I'm not really into like reading definitions as you can read them yourself. So as I said, you can either do adaptation, DRR, which is disaster risk reduction, or you can do all of them, right? And actually, I'd like to play a video, if that's okay, because I think it explains this a lot better than I can explain it, and it's a bit visual as well.
Impacts of climate change can already be felt today. We are experiencing climate-related extreme weather events such as floods, heat waves, or storms, and the beginning of slow onset events, including sea level rise, increasing temperatures, or desertification. Despite all mitigation and adaptation efforts, some degree of residual risk of climate change impacts remains. This affects human and natural systems and may result in loss and damage. Those can be of economic nature, like decrease of harvest and infrastructure damages, or non-economic nature, namely the loss of life, land, cultural heritage, and biodiversity. To manage the residual risk, the German government developed comprehensive climate risk management. Instead of applying individual and standalone measures, CRM involves a combination of proven and innovative instruments. Climate risk assessment builds the foundation of CRM. By identifying risks and assessing the magnitude of impacts, CRM shows possible instruments answering the question, how could we respond? The assessment then helps to identify the smartest mix of instruments to prepare for climate-related extreme events and for strengthening overall resilience. Based on the identified CRM measures, decision makers from the public and private sector are enabled to better prioritize, fund, and implement options. Monitoring and evaluating the implemented measures leads to continuous learning, therefore answering the question, how will we respond? The CRM approach helps to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. With each step, we learn more about climate risks and the effectiveness of the CRM instruments, enabling us to improve the recommendations and develop new measures.
The video kind of explains what this is, what CRM is in a bit more detail. But before we can really understand what the management systems are, we also need to understand what the climate risk assessment is, which is part of the whole CRM kind of methodology. So as you can see, I'll share some of the resources like the video that was being played. This is all obviously done by GIZ, but these are really good resources for you guys to have. So I'll definitely share them with Medea and the team, and then they can forward it to you. So the climate risk assessment is a 6-step methodology. So first we, as it says, do the analysis of the status quo. So that is basically what the reality of the situation is, not how you want to shape the reality. So this can be done through monitoring and evaluation, research and development, things like that. Then you have to also kind of do an analysis of what certain hotspots for your assessment are. So for instance, if you are a company that is working on, solar panels or something like that, right? You have to analyze like what are the risks associated with that. So for instance, as we know, in Pakistan, a lot of taxation goes up and down when it comes to renewable energy. Sometimes the tariff is levied, sometimes it's taken off. So that really impacts how renewable energy is scaled up in the country. So that's a hotspot, right? So then we do development of a context-specific methodological approach, which is kind of like a worst-case scenario of what could possibly go wrong, and you kind of try to do some kind of planning around that. So that also comes into the climate adaptation kind of policy. Then qualitative and quantitative risk assessment. So this means not only the numbers that will be impacted. So numbers means like your customer base, that could be affected, but also the quality. So that could be two ways. Your customer quality could also go down. So for instance, if you have international and local customers, that could be also one of the factors, but it could also be the quality of your product could also go down, right? So the quality that you're providing your customer, that could also go down. Then evaluation of risk tolerance. So risk tolerance is also done by monitoring and evaluation. And you have to basically build this kind of, you kind of go back to the hotspot analysis, and you have to kind of understand that how well would your product or service actually stand in the face of that risk if it happened. Then lastly, it's the identification of feasible options in that case. So kind of like a plan B in case all else fails, right? Also, one thing I wanted to point out is that climate risk management can mean two things. So a lot of the times the way it's framed is that your business is identifying the risks you might face in the case of a climate emergency, right? But a lot of the times how we don't think about it, and the way we should think about it, is that is your company posing any risk to the environment? So that's also a risk, right? Because you want to be part of the solution. You don't want to make the problem worse. And when we think about this, I think it is a bit of a complex issue, because there's lots of, because, we are trying to transition into the clean energy, clean economy, but that isn't very straightforward, actually. Just because something is clean energy or green does not mean it's, without risk for the planet. Maybe it will fall somewhere in the moderate or maybe in the high, because the problem is that electric vehicles are still reliant on electricity, which, as you know, comes from fossil fuels mostly. And then in Pakistan, electric vehicles, because we have such an energy crisis, so then, how will we do this transition to electric vehicles, even though it's a very hot market in Pakistan right now? I'd like to just discuss a little bit this article I wrote a couple of years back on electric vehicles to give you a bit of a context as well. So this was a research article I did for this German foundation called Heinrich Böll Stiftung. And basically, I took the mining that has been happening in the Arctic for the first time, because there is such a high demand of electric vehicles in Scandinavia, that there is, for the first time, this copper mining happening over there, which is really, really bad for the indigenous communities there, and it's causing a really bad carbon footprint. So see, this is what I'm trying to say, that just because something is green doesn't necessarily mean it is good for the environment. So in case I can share this article if anyone wants to read it. But yeah, let's move on. So yeah, so I also wanted to go into what really is a carbon footprint. Like, we hear this all the time. It's pretty simple, actually. It's, I'm sure all of you know, it's, like how much your greenhouse gases emissions are as an individual, as a country, as a company. But, there is a lot of, one thing I will say, there's a lot of, and I think we all grew up with this. I think maybe you're all born 80s, 90s. I was born in 89. So I really grew up with this idea and this branding and this marketing that, reuse, reduce, recycle, and that, we as individuals can really make a difference within the environment. That is not true. Even if we all stopped eating meat and didn't buy anything, it would make a difference. But it is the companies and the governments that are mostly, especially the private sector, that is making the most emissions. And obviously the big high polluting countries like the United States, actually India and China, especially China, is getting quite up there, and India might in the next few years be a very high emitter as well, despite its post-colonial status. So that is something to consider. But I think for your companies, these tools that calculate carbon footprints and emissions is really beneficial. So these are some resources. And the one I use personally for work is the USAID one and the RET screen. It's a bit complicated in the beginning, but you get a hang of it. I have no training in, I'm really bad at math and all these things, but if I can do it, I'm sure all of you can learn to do it as well. It's not that, it looks more complicated than it is. So I also wanted to go a little bit into kind of connecting carbon footprint with utilizing sustainability models. So what really is sustainable development? I do think it's, even though it's like a catch-all kind of phrase, it's a little bit of a, I think in today's times, it's a contradictory statement. Sustainable development, I think the fact that we think development can be sustainable is actually, I think, something that is showing that it's not really true. There's also this model called degrowth, which is a very radical thinking that for actual sustainability and the planet to actually, for humans on the planet to have survival, we actually need to go into something that's called degrowth, which doesn't mean we stop expanding our economy. So sustainable development, just to say some of these lines on here, it says meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Sustainability is a possibility that human and other forms of life on Earth will flourish forever. And then sustainable development is enough for all forever. So basically it's, don't take more than you need. So that's basically, I think, the crux of all of these definitions. So then when we talk about sustainable development, there's a couple of pillars, as we call them. So there's three: there's social, economic, and environmental, as you might have guessed. And this is a bit of old school thinking, but it was called the prism of sustainable development. But it's, used a lot now as well. And the four pillars are, or four dimensions, I would say. So there's the economic dimension, that is, of course, what man-made capital, like buildings, companies, all these things, roads, infrastructure. Environmental dimension is the capital, is the natural capitals of the natural world, forests, mangroves, things like that. Then we have the social dimension, which is the human capital, which is, of course, humans, and then that's based for institutional. So that's systemic and structural. So what we mean by systemic and structural is that they can either act as, I would say, barriers to being more sustainable, or they can be vessels and vehicles for sustainability. If you think of, so a prism basically has, different sides. And when we talk about these four dimensions, we're basically, okay, if you think of it as layering, right? So we first think about the environmental dimension, right? So if we think imagine if we were not on the planet, right? And it was just like a natural world. And then we kind of then start building upon another world that humans have created. That's another dimension, right? And how did humans do that is through a social dimension and institutions, right? So we created schools, we created churches and mosques, and we created, like this whole like institutional framework that allowed us to have this kind of development and progress and economy in the world, right? So the way these three things, institutional, we kind of put in the social. So the way these three interact with each other is how we build models. So as I'll go into a bit more detail in the next slides, there's different ways you can merge these three together, and that kind of identifies how sustainable your model actually is. So let me go ahead and then maybe that'll get more clear. So this is called the three-leg sustainability model. So basically the idea is that we have three legs. One is environmental, one is social, and one is economic. So environmental has all of these, kind of tenets. It has a natural world. So as you know, we have forests and mangroves and all these things, as I said. But this also comes into what our environmental policy is, what our energy policies are, what our, consumer policies are. So that kind of goes into that. Then we have the economic leg, which is made up of, companies and organizations and, startups and SMEs, infrastructure, jobs, trading, all of these things. And then the social leg has different components like culture, health and education, arts, health services, like all of these things. So each leg is made out of all of these things, right? And the idea is that if one leg was broken or wobbly, the whole stool would be wobbly or broken and you could not sit on it or you would fall, right? So it's not the most sustainable model because they're all working not in tandem, but they're separate. So there's not enough overlap. So in that way, this was one of the first sustainability models that was being used that kind of envision all these things a bit, not together. Then they thought, okay, maybe we can have this kind of model, which is called the three circles overlapping model. Over here, we see the economy, society, environment as like a Venn diagram that comes together first. This is like the sweet spot, right? Where it says sustainability lives here. But the problem with this model, like it sounds great, but the problem is that we live in a realistic world, right? Like things are not perfect. All of these circles over here are the same size, but actually, as we know in the world, that's not how it works, right? How it's working right now, our economy is huge, like it's a huge circle. Society then is a bit bigger, but not just because our society is so just and equal, but because we have such a massive population, right? And then the environment actually is probably the least of our priorities, globally speaking, right? So in that way, this is not a very sustainable model. So thirdly, lastly, this is maybe the newest kind of model that a lot of sustainability scientists think it might be, still has issues, but maybe out of the three, the best one. So it's called the three nested dependencies model. So over here, we understand that this is that each is dependent on each other and that they all actually operate within the environment, the larger environment. And if something goes wrong in one, the other will be affected, especially if something goes wrong in the environment, which is being affected by the economy and society, then the economy and society will suffer. So for instance, question to all of you, when the Pakistan floods happened, was it an environmental disaster, a social disaster, or an economic disaster? So just a few questions to consider before we move on. So which sustainability model do you think is most dominant in the world today? These two, I would say, are the most dominant in a way. And then the three nested dependencies one is the reality of the situation, but our sustainability usually isn't seen in this way, or like our policies aren't made in this way where we understand how these things impact each other. Like for instance, we have an environmental policy, we have an economic policy, but if you go through policy briefs, you will realize that these are actually treated like such separate issues. They're not ever like hardly any kind of policy or any safety mechanism that thinks of these two. So also some questions about which sustainability model is most relevant or accurate to your business. So recently I wrote an article about climate justice in Gilgit-Baltistan. So as you know, as I'm sure most of you know, that when the Attabad Lake disaster happened in 2010, that's actually what created the Attabad Lake that we all know to be very beautiful, but actually it's a water graveyard when you really think about it, right? And it's interesting how now there's a lot of tourism, of course, happening around that area, and a lot of like these high-end hotels have come about that obviously it's not made by the people of Gilgit, but it's people coming in from the rest of Pakistan. And even though they're saying, oh, this is, we've made this hotel, it's good for the economy and it'll uplift the society, but actually it's going to have a more negative impact on that environment, right? Because it's not actually sustainable. So moving on. Okay, so this is like, I would say, one of the most happening topics in sustainability right now. It's economic social governance, ESG. You might have heard this word thrown around a lot. So it's touted as like this, very innovative sustainability model, but there's a lot of criticism that it's going to allow companies to kind of carry on with business as usual. So I'll tell you a bit about more ESG and the good and bad points. So ESG is basically a framework that helps stakeholders understand how an organization is managing risks and opportunities related to environmental, social, and governance criteria, sometimes called ESG factors. So one other thing I wanted to say that, right now we're talking about, we're like in a transitionary space right now, where we are trying to change the world into a more sustainable place. And when we say sustainable, it's not just environmental, it's social as well, right? So as we know that, women and minorities do not, in the current world order, don't have the same opportunities as men, and even if women do have the same equal opportunities, they have so many barriers that to actually succeed in those opportunities is very difficult, right? So for instance, you might get the same job, great job, top job as a man, but if you have children and all of these things that are your primary responsibility, you're going to be suffering more, right? And you're more time poor. So these are like all things to consider, right? So this is kind of reimagining these things and kind of being like holistic with it. And then governance also takes into consideration that what are actually the environmental and social policies that the government has, not only just for the specific country, but also the company. So as we know, lots of corporations like Nestle, Coca-Cola, they have actual governance structures, right? So it's about holding them accountable. So people who are at the top, they can be held accountable for the decisions they make, right? I notice in Pakistan, a lot of startups in lots of spaces, they are working more with sometimes, getting grants, or they're kind of link with the CSR of like big corporations, so things like that. So it's good to know that things are changing a bit. So, but why are climate activists skeptical of this? So there's one kind of skepticism is that it's not standardized, right? Just like CSR was never standardized, ESG is obviously lots of steps ahead of that because it actually takes into ESG accounting and finance. But there's no actual gold standard, right? So a lot of companies actually end up greenwashing. Recently, I think last year, Coca-Cola made the first ever plastic road in Islamabad, right? Like right next to, I think, that's not the solution. You can't make a road out of plastic. That's still like the plastic won't disintegrate. That's still a problem. So this is a big issue with ESG as well. And if you notice, so ESG is also closer to the 3 overlapping model than the nested approach. So again, it's, your economy, your economic incentives could be way bigger than your social ones. So that's again, not really what we call true sustainability. So this is ISP environmental solutions. That is really interesting kind of circularity company. And this is actually how we make our pitch decks, just so they're a bit different. I mean, that might give you some ideas as well. And, it gives you a good overview of like how many emissions, how much energy you want to produce, how much emissions are you taking into consideration. So these are just some ideas. So then Eco Energy is a solar company. So yeah, so this is the impact it has. So these are some. So Easy Bike, you might have seen them around Islamabad. So again, this has different kinds of impact. It's kind of, changing the infrastructure, e-mobility infrastructure in Pakistan. Then we have Green Innovation, which again is circular economy. It has, basically, it's kind of replacing LPG. Then we have Light Solar, that's another solar company. Again, Mode Mobility, and they're really interesting because they have bikes that are specially made for women. Then Easy Geezer, again, very interesting work that they're doing in the market. Functioning autonomous, like using IoT. So they're like really like smart geezers. So that's all. Thank you everyone.